work adjacent issues, right? I think many of you have mentioned that these issues cannot be separated from quality of work. At one point, I think it was maybe Lance who said, this is not just about quality of work, it's about quality of living. And so this is two subjects that we want to talk about together for about 20 minutes. And instead of a small group, we're all going to do it together, but I'm hoping that we can create that same dynamic of a conversation that we had in the smaller groups. So I'm actually going to ask Maria to comment first on her thoughts about this cluster, and then ask you all to build on, reflect on, and converse off of Maria's comment, please.
Sure. Thank you, Julie. In looking at these two, I think they're really important when we're talking about quality of life, and certainly coming from a chamber organization, quality of life is very important. And when I looked at the items that we talked about that were identified here in item number 5 about the work adjacent barriers, I sort of whispered under my breath and I said, boy, if we can solve all these things, I'll be out of a job. But I really do believe that, from a business perspective, that it's important when we come to the table to look at our communities in a holistic manner, not just about members of the chamber, not just about the business community, but our entire community is dependent upon these attributes that are mentioned, these items that are mentioned here. We talk about the issues around affordability, and that is really impacting our workforce, which then impacts the business community. And it's affordability in all these items that are mentioned here: housing, transportation, childcare. The list is long for sure. So when I look at, where the intersection is from a business standpoint and what quality of life means, and when you bridge that with the work that we're doing on this commission and the future work, we cannot ignore these things. I think it's important for us to look at these, and while they would call them adjacent, it's almost like they're integrated very much with the work that we're doing here today. So I wanted to comment on that. I know I just kind of whispered that under my breath, but I really do believe that we're headed in the right direction if we're tackling these things as well.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted a couple comments just to build on exactly what you said. I mean, first, I guess in this area, I would want to call out more squarely issues, this is not going to be any big surprise, of homelessness and length of commute, related to the housing issue. So maybe an array of housing related issues. Incarceration as an adjacent barrier to employment. A history of incarceration, a criminal record is a huge barrier to employment. Disability, we've spoken relatively little about that, but that I think we need to put that on the table as an adjacent issue. And then a second and different issue I just wanted to raise is you talk here about modernizing and strengthening the social safety net. And I think this is a complicated area. We've talked a little bit about how to use technology to simplify the way that businesses access supports, and certainly the way that individuals, for example, might access the earned income tax credit. Betty just said they were going to be, Commissioner Yee said they were going to be putting that online so that people can access that on a monthly basis. That's a good example. But I think there's a larger question there, which really cuts to the heart, where we've been talking about skills, and then we've been talking about sort of the raising the floor, and the issue that, a third of California workers are making $15 an hour or less. And I guess I would just put out there, like, what is this commission going to say about the ability of the business community, if you will, to raise the floor, as opposed to whether there has to be some public sector partnership to raise the floor? Now, there are adjacent issues like health insurance that obviously fall in that category, but there's also subsidies for affordable housing. there's subsidies for transportation, and then there's just direct subsidy through an earned income tax credit, through whatever the welfare programs are. Right now, that's another system that, in relation to what we're talking about, is very broken. And people talk about it as an incentive for work, as though people are trying not to work and they have to be incented. I think people want to work. Most people want to work as much as they can. They really want to, for a variety of reasons. But the way that all those systems are set up right now, it in fact makes it hard. In fact, there's an incentive not to work, or not to work very much, because otherwise you lose the support you may need. And particularly in an economy that changes fast, if you yourself have a number of different challenges you're struggling with. So I just think there's a more we're not going to solve that on this commission, but I just think in terms of the way we frame the problem, it's a much deeper, it's a much bigger problem. And, people are talking about UBI and things like that, and that, this verges into universal basic income and other conversations like that.
At the risk of saying something that is, maybe worth disagreeing with, because I agree with all these additions, I wonder whether we ought to take a point of view on the importance and priority of some of the work adjacent barriers. And I just submit that housing, to me, seems like a candidate to be one ahead of all of the rest, because A, it affects every single person, and B, it is more of a central cause for other issues. If you address housing, it helps you address transportation. If you address transportation, it doesn't necessarily help you address housing. And I'm not trying to diminish the importance of other things, injustices and critical social issues, but I do think that the longer the list gets, the more it's incumbent on us to select among the list what to focus on.
I agree with the housing, just to piggyback to the housing comment, especially given California and just the way the speculative real estate market, the valuation of real estate and housing costs. And in some ways, this number 5 is really related back to wages and the first cluster, because in some ways, $15 minimum wage in San Francisco is like a little over $30,000. There's no way you can live anywhere in a 30-mile radius of San Francisco making $15. So I think in some ways, like, the wages just have not risen to the level of, so cost of living needs to be taken into account. Some of the others, like healthcare, childcare, I think I would actually think of them as number 6. I think we need to think about the safety net in a much broader way than, in some ways, there's been a dismantling of the safety net over time, privatization. And in some ways, I think that healthcare, childcare, elder care, retirement, all of those should be part of something that everyone gets. And so I would sort of move those, and they should be portable, just like Social Security is, that sort of travels with you regardless of who your employer is. And I think one thing that I think the privatization is important, and over time, we've gotten a smaller and smaller safety net over the years. And as Commissioner Carla talked about, in some ways, the eligibility for any kind of benefit has gotten harder and harder. Seniors impoverish themselves in order to get Medicaid, to get home care, selling their assets, selling their homes in order to be eligible for Medicaid. And so I do think part of it is thinking about revenue and what are the revenue streams that can support this sort of, I think, a more robust safety net for sort of all workers.
Follow-up question, because what you said about the connection between cost and the need to increase wages, John made a comment in the small group that was similar, and I wonder if one way to address is to be clear about the overlapping intersections and like, somewhat dependency of one problem with others elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yes, okay,
I think
okay.
that's right. And I think just going back to what Manuel Pastor talked about, I do think legislating increase in wages has been really important to get it up to 15, but in some ways, I think the reinstating of wage boards is important because then you can have a mechanism to analyze and set wages based on cost of living, but also based on empowered workers, right? Like, and it's a mechanism for sort of worker voice and workers shaping certain standards. I think it's just interesting to think about even the mechanism. And that's something that's missing here, like not only in terms of what are sort of the regulations or the safety nets, but what are the mechanisms for both implementing them, but also for continuing to like institutionalizing a way to continue to modernize and update them over time. Right?
So, in the same way, I was describing how governors like me would come to California and poach businesses. The same kind of thing is happening with respect to workers, skilled workers in particular, because of and you all are from here, many of you born here, but really this cost of housing is shocking. It's shocking if you come from somewhere else. I'm still in shock about how much we had to pay for our house. I mean, coming from Michigan, where you can get a fantastic house for $200,000. And in Detroit, they are giving property and vacant property and property to be rebuilt for like $20,000 or $30,000 to young people who will come and be entrepreneurs to help rebuild the city. So to Doug's point from before, I don't think that anybody can sit on their laurels and believe that this kind of cost can be sustainable for a state that is trying to continue to innovate and attract, et cetera. Yes, you have great weather, and there's no doubt about that. But there are other states that have okay weather, and you're competing you're not competing just with yourself. You're competing with the rest of the country who are looking at 3.3% unemployment rate as well and trying to poach. So I just want to emphasize that these ancillary issues have to be addressed. And I wish I had the answer for how you reduce the cost of housing, but it has got to be numero uno because it is complete deterrent. And just as one anecdote, my 30-year-old son and his wife live in our basement, even because they cannot afford to live anywhere. I mean, I love them. They're great roommates. But I mean, you're seeing and it's fine to have multi-family, generational housing. That's great. But giving people a chance to accumulate some kind of wealth it's got to be part of the future of California, if not the future of work.
If I could just build on the theme that I raised at the first convening where I mentioned this future of living, I've thought more about it in the intervening time, so I'm glad we have this opportunity right now. There's this tension of location that we all face, that you need to live somewhere, and in most cases, you need to work somewhere. And more, that's becoming more distant, either in time or distance. That I tweeted right after I started on the commission that every Californian should be able to live, work, and thrive within 30 minutes of each of those activities. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily 30 minutes, then 30 minutes, so you're 90 minutes away, but somehow have some kind of construct or an aspiration to get toward. Now, I live 28 miles from downtown Sacramento, so I meet part of that threshold, but it takes me an hour to get to work during rush hour. There's no other way to do that. I make that choice. But do I make that choice where to live more than I make the choice where I work? That's the tension that I'm trying to reconcile for myself. But there are tens of thousands of Californians driving every day during the week from the Central Valley to a coastal location to work because the job pays well there. And they've made a choice for what they consider to be a high quality of living. I'll live somewhere else and I'll make the sacrifice and do the drive time. It's just not a sustainable model. To the governor's point, we can't keep doing that. It might have worked well. And for those of you that have been in California, at least since the 1980s, when Chevron moved from the Bay Area, from San Francisco to San Ramon, that seemed like it moved to Nevada. And if you look at it as the crow flies, that probably was a 20-mile linear move. But it seemed at the time that was massive. But that's what is happening. And we keep moving to the point where I don't know how much is left laterally in California to sustain that. So I'm going to circle back to what may be a conclusion. Where are the people? How are we designing to get them there, or to live there and plan for that? And then get the jobs there. Because the tension involves the tension on our infrastructure, the roads, the highways, living, just, there's a quality of life, but I think there's a quality of living. That's being strained. And that's the risk that we're all running, no matter what sector you happen to be in. But if there's 500,000 workers in the Central Valley that are driving 100 miles and 3 hours each way to work, we need to flip that paradigm. And then we'll start to see a lot of things in California improving. But that's that tension that I'm still trying to articulate as we go through this commission proceeding. But it's not just about work and what you do when you show up to work and when you leave. It's what you do all of those other times during the day. And I don't want to broaden our jurisdiction or our commitment, but really, I think that's what we're looking at.
It strikes me with these comments, like, I think our report or our set of recommendations, we have a great opportunity, I think, to tell the story of the impact of housing on work in California, workers and work in California in a different, so that's a different angle on it. I mean, there are other panels on housing or homelessness or whatever, but this is about the impact of the problem of affordable housing on work, and maybe to tell the story of some spots where it is working, like where is it working well, and what are the factors that have gone into that, who has done what, where has the business community acted, or where has there been improvement. But I think we have a really good story to make a powerful case for how affordability and work are connected.
This thing about housing, childcare, early childhood health care is so big that, like everything else we're talking about here, if I didn't censor myself, I would probably try to monopolize all the time to talk about it. But since this morning we were talking about how workers are too busy working to be able to come to these meetings, I thought I would share the story of the Lyft driver who brought me over here this morning, whose parents immigrated here from India, who has a college education and a lot of debt, who is a government employee with a union job, who moonlights by driving for Lyft, had 2 kids, both of them in preschool, with, I think she said, either $3,000 or $3,500 a monthly payment for that child care. Her husband works too. She told me she hadn't taken a vacation in 2 years because she was banking all her vacation money because she made a plan to save up for a down payment to buy a home. And she's going next week to Henderson, Nevada to look for a house because she can get a brand new house in a neighborhood where her kids can bike to school and where she feels safe letting them outside for $250,000. And man, I just feel like her story, that's the problem we're trying to solve for here.
Thank you, Don. Okay, so I'm going to transition us, unless there's any other comments to build on that. But clearly, you've all made the strong case for why this cluster is still here, even though at the very first conversation we were talking about guardrails and what are we not going to address. It's impossible to hear from you all that to address the future of work without thinking of this. So, but there were some good ideas for deepening and maybe fleshing out some nuance in these. So thank you. So really, the last thing before we wanted to hear from the public is just to get some thoughts. We broke these into clusters. We asked last time if there's anything that's missing, anything should be added. I want to make sure that what you thought should be added was added. And also I'll give you another chance. Is there anything that is missing that should be on here or should not be on here when we actually, and again, we're not going to finalize anything in the sense that once we finalize a document, it's static, right? Everything we're saying about how we look at our work and the future of work is also true about how we work, which is that there's always going to be chances to improve and to refine and to deepen. But since we are the first public collective statement of the commission is going to be this one in January, that's going to look very much like this in terms of problem categories. We just wanted to allow a conversation about the big picture one more time. And we'll bring it back to you in January to look at, right? So we're not saying now you've given comments and then just trust that something will appear that looks like what you said. January will be spent allowing you to look at what we've done. And I think there was a consensus that we don't want to line edit in a group setting, but we want to make sure that's reflective. Roy, you look like you had something.
Yeah, I don't think I fully realized that this was going to be released as a separate item. And I think I might have just missed that in the explanation of the process. I'd submit that I find it hard to fully react to this without what I'd been calling before the story that comes before it of how do we think about what is happening and what's in the future? How do we do things like elucidate, the damaging effect of housing? And I can't imagine even an edited version of this list that would meaningfully contribute to the public conversation without much more of that broader context, much more of the stuff we talked about earlier, specificity to California, examples, vivid facts, provocative storytelling, et cetera. So I don't know how others feel about that. And maybe that's what we're saying, is that's the kind of edit we're talking about. So it may just be a procedural point, but that's the general feeling I've got.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in some ways, and it came up in both rounds of the other clusters, is that I think we also want, and maybe it's in the stories, but I think some of this is solutions for different sectors. So there does need to be a lens of looking at the different industries or different kind of work, because, for example, workforce development is not a framework that works for domestic workers, partly because no matter how much training you get the same wage. So unless you do, so I think it's like workforce development needs to be coupled with like a wage scale, right? So there has to be some policy interventions, for example, though I know that's not the case in what we heard today around manufacturing, right? So I think one is also some projections around like, where do we see growth? Knowing that we don't know, there's a lot of stuff we don't know, but like, what are the sectors that are growing based on what we do know in projections? And a little bit of the solutions being somewhat specific, and maybe it's in some of the stories of like particular worker profiles. And then the second thing is, and I remember this in the first, in our first convening, is in some ways, I think it may be good to also signal to the other future of work conversations that happened, because most of the future of work conversations are about AI and automations and robots taking over, or the need to upskill workers, right? Like that's really the dominant narratives. And I think it's what's exciting about this commission from the first convening is that in some ways we've really oriented towards talking about this as future of workers on some level, and really trying to shift that paradigm, like robots aren't taking, like debunking some of those myths and those narratives. So maybe it's just in the framing or the introduction around like what distinguishes this future of work conversation from, because most of the future of work, actually most of us are not even in, like they're mostly led by corporate, big corporations and talking about robots and not workers or like the issues that are in this problem statement. So
I just want to make sure that anybody else has any comments on that, or that we should suggest a process to deal with these comments. Are there any other questions?
I just, it seems like our next employment and labor law that we're going to tackle wage theft, tip theft, violations of rights. Isn't that not right? or not really, no?
I think we were looking at a little bit more structure. So, limits of labor law, given
I see.
evolution in work type. And there's also a big data piece to it, right? Which I think there's been some hunger for talking about. So, but go ahead.
I'm sorry, I thought the question right now was what's missing from here? Or
Yeah.
I see violations of workers' rights somewhat mentioned in number 2, but from the framework of access to quality jobs, I don't know. It just seems like, to me, that was a glaring, I don't see that here very much reflected. And for low-wage workers, it's obviously an enormous part of the problem.
Yeah, just sort of chiming in on that, we sort of, the way we talked about that was in number 4, adding not just that the current labor laws are inadequate, but current enforcement of existing laws are also inadequate.
Employment laws, yes.
Employment laws, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other piece, I mean, just in terms of what's missing, and I think this is kind of consistent with Roy's comment about narrative and Mariana's as well. I still am struggling, particularly when I try to think about number 6 and number 9. I think there's this implicit assumption there that there's been this dramatic change in the structure of work and employment, and I don't think the data shows that exactly. And so I think, and Anmol and I were talking about this a little bit during the break, I think if we could get a little bit more robust data on things like tenure at employment to really see if it's going way down, because my understanding of the data is it's not, it's actually climbing up a little bit. And so maybe the problem is that people are switching jobs more rapidly, so they're supplementing their existing badly paid jobs with additional badly paid jobs, which is a different problem than needing to re-skill everybody constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, one way of looking at, sorry, was somebody else waiting to speak? One way of looking at that is that maybe another descriptor of this story that I've been talking about is just getting the fact base that we agree on that is the right fact base in entirety would be helpful. I mean, for example, that's something we've studied pretty carefully, and job tenures have shrunk dramatically for white men. Basically, for everybody else, they've always been working in this way and so the media overstates that in part because because of the biases of the media. And so I do think all of us getting on the same page on how bad is this problem? Which part of it do we care the most about? What's getting worse versus staying stable feels like an essential input.
Yep. So, thank you. That's very great comments. I do think that I want to say, I think I heard something a little bit different, although there was initially agreement, maybe some broad agreement, but also a little bit of divergence in the sense that it might be maybe premature to put something out that's this document or some edited version of this document without the broader context of what are sort of the other 2 chapters, right? I'm using all these terms kind of loosely, but what we talked about was 3 components of a report that would come out in May. And one of them is that fact base. And then one of them is this sort of challenges, scope of problem, and the third would be the portfolio of recommendations. We're obviously not ready for 3. We're just about to shift to that in January. But I thought maybe, and I think this was kind of driving our thinking about putting something out in January, is what we've done just in the last few months, what you all have come to is different, it's unique, it's unique both because it's California and because what California can do about them is exciting. And so although it would come out in isolation, and again, it would not be static necessarily when it comes out in January, it could be informed by whatever happens in 1 and in, oh, there's 2 ones. but 1. Yeah. But is the idea that putting something out is really, it's a signal of what this commission is doing as opposed to where this commission is going to end up. And that there's value in that, given that there was tremendous interest when the governor first announced it in May, when he appointed you all a few months later, and then when we started out in September. So that the thinking was that there'd be something that would demonstrate, not just to the public who has been able to participate, which we love, but everyone else too, about kind of directionally what we're thinking, where we are, and what's different about it.
Julie, just looking at that right there. So these items that we reviewed this afternoon, that falls under the challenges and scope of problems. The portfolio of recommendations, so that's yet to come. But this report out that you're talking about, would it just be, I guess it's 1 and 1? The first two items, or?
Just be the middle one,
Just the middle one. I see. Okay.
the January
Okay.
one would just be, the first one, I think we had some presentations about that in December. We've had various presentations about data. And, I think there was a call for more about California specifically. And so there's some of it we've done in the very first category, but some of it we want to capture and organize in a way that would form the fact base for the entire May 1 report.
I just wanted to suggest when we do number, whatever, challenges scope, that if it's possible to give a salient fact and a salient story for each problem or challenge, I think you'd begin to do the work of the fact base in the context of identifying what the problems and challenges are, and I think you'd make the problems and challenges more accessible to the average person.
And along those lines, I would actually suggest having some boxes with some worker stories in there to put a face on it and to ground it and what it really means for California workers. Yeah.
Wait,
And
I'm
some
sorry,
of the
we're talking about,
testimony.
what are we talking about, the first one or the problem? In terms of what that would be added
I
to?
also want to return to one of the problem statements, but I don't want to interrupt this conversation about.
Okay, but Doug, I think the question Sarah had is that the suggestion for the first component up there, the second?
I
and the third?
would say that every single one, we ought to have worker stories, because there are also success stories that we can put in the recommendations as well about what is working for workers. So
So one other thing I just wanted to share about process, and I'm sorry that Mary Kay and James are not here to describe this a little bit. They would do it so much better than I'm going to. But one of the things that we've thought about is a reason to put this out is not only what I said earlier, right, to signal kind of where we've come and why we're different, but also to help organize the discussion about the portfolio of recommendations, right? I think one of the challenges we've had since the very beginning is how do we go from all this rich information, thinking, difficulty, and possibility to concrete ideas. And something that Mary Kay and James had framed out for us was the possibility of taking the categories and then mapping them to various actors who we would make recommendations to, as well as various types of recommendations, whether they're short-term, mid-term, long-term, something's tried and already done versus scaling something big versus moonshot, whatever that is. So again, it's not meant to be a final statement of the challenge scope of problem, but it is meant to be somewhat of an organizing document so we can move to the next phase without being overwhelmed by everything that's out there.
Okay, I probably going to say something unpopular. I would feel a little embarrassed, I have to say, to be a part of, if this were being put out public, if that's what we're talking about right now, without a stronger, clearer, stronger protagonist for how inequality is happening in California. And what I mean by that is a lot of these problems are described as trends that are happening sort of naturally, organically. They are happening without anybody really driving them. And I think the public in America right now in California is very clear that corporations are driving these problems. And so I don't see that language in here. I don't see corporate control of our democracy, corporations driving inequality, corporations lacking in accountability. This is all stuff that's happening sort of without a protagonist. And so I wouldn't want to put this out, me personally, without adding that. And that to me is also why I hope it was heard. I would want a number 11, that we are also being very clear to regulate and make sure that we're not returning to the problems of 50 years ago, allowing companies to regress because we're really holding to we're holding to changes that are happening and not pretending as if they're not, again, I'm terrible with metaphors, but a new sheep, a new wolf, when it's really an old wolf. I know I'm mixing
Yeah,
metaphors.
no.
I'm terrible with metaphors.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it was in the first cluster was some of our conversation, which was everything is written in a passive language as though no one is actually responsible. So I think it's that like in some ways there's inequality is actually a symptom of corporate consolidation of power, financialization of our economy, et cetera. So I think it's like having a little bit more of the cause of these sort of dynamics in this economy.
I would just want to clarify, though, that we're really talking about big
Yes.
corporations
Yeah,
and
yeah,
not
yeah.
these
Yeah,
smaller
corporate
ones
uh-huh.
that we are,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
This was, I wanted to pile on this one because I raised this in our small group too. It says here that worker power and organization is shrinking, but it doesn't say that corporate power and
It's growing, yeah.
organization is increasing. And that's part of the problem here. And whether somebody mentioned monopsonies, somebody mentioned, we talked about globalization. We can talk about the role of private equity and just talk to a Toys R Us worker. I mean, there are so many different examples around how increased corporate power is coming at the cost of everybody else. And fortunately, we have people here who are saying, well, actually, when we look at things like housing affordability and education system, this is hurting corporate bottom lines too. So we have heard from some enlightened employers in here. I argued at the last meeting that I have much more experience dealing with employers that are not enlightened, unfortunately. So I do think we need to call that out. And I really think we need to talk about the fact that we could pass new regulations, Saru. I mean, we have the chair of the labor committee here who sees dozens of bills before his committee every year. Some of them pass, some of them get signed into law, some of them get killed. But a law is only as good as the enforcement. And we have some of the best labor laws in the United States and California. We have the strongest joint employer liability law. We have the strongest laws protecting immigrant workers from threats of retaliation around their immigration status if they want to file a complaint with Cal OSHA or a wage complaint with the labor commissioner because they're not getting paid minimum wage. Well, the law doesn't matter if it's not being enforced. And if the state and local government are not putting enough money into the enforcement of these labor laws. So these are the two things that I agree with Saru. I would like to see more of a corporate critique. And I, like John said, would like to see more about enforcement of existing laws.
Just make a comment, just a thought, because I think having a landscape of where we're at is great. That's a great idea. We should cite, what we're dealing with. I would hope that we would define it in a manner where we could bring people to the table. We could bring companies to the table and not generalize. So I think it's important that we try to, however we describe it, that we leave ourselves open to driving a solution with a collaborative effort and not alienate. And I'm not suggesting that we don't lay out the landscape, but if we can, because not everybody, falls into that category. But I do believe that would be important to identify state what the landscape is, but also allow us the opportunity to be collaborative and once we get to those solutions.
I just wanted to weigh in to say, I think, I think in a way, when I got on this commission, I was sort of waiting for this moment to come because I think it was inevitable. I mean, it is a group, it's a diverse group. We have unions, business, others at the table. And I don't have an answer for this. I think these are really centrally important issues. And on the one hand, I think we want to be clear about where there's tell the story well and be clear about where there's responsibility and what that responsibility is. And at the same time, obviously, given that this is a statewide commission report, we want to enlist as many people as possible in putting their shoulder to the wheel to fix this. And, and I think it's going to cut eventually to the issues, which I think we'll discuss with solutions around, what are we going to suggest in terms of lawmaking or incentives, and then regulation versus, pressure, if you will, to accountability in a way. So, I think this is really a difficult to get right, but you're hearing the very real issues. And so it sounds like we're going to see a draft, or if that's correct. And so it seems like a little bit the devil's in the details here on what we see.
So I'll make 2 suggestions just on the fly here, and everybody should feel free to destroy them as appropriate. The first is that we do exactly what Carla said, which is we take all the input, we revise to create something that we can bring in January for consideration. I think we don't have to, we're not required to do anything other than come up with a report of some sort in May 1, which is part of the executive order. And that's one path. The other is if there's just a very strong feeling that there's no benefit or not enough of a benefit to produce the second component before we do the whole thing, then we don't have to do that. We can just wait until we do all of it together, right? I've laid out what sort of in our thinking what the benefit is, right? It's the signaling of where we are, what makes California different, and it's also kind of a framing for where we go. But if that's either premature or impossible to do, then we certainly don't want to push that. So one option is we work hard to incorporate, come back with something that everybody would be proud to actually put out. And if it doesn't happen, we don't do it anyway, or we just wait and we put it all together because any one piece cannot stand on its own.
For what it's worth, I'm a fan of trying to have as much conversation about these trade-offs as soon as possible in our process, because I feel like otherwise we just end up out of kindness and politeness deferring the hard questions till the very end and being unable to resolve them. Like, I think this question about corporate concentration of power is implicit in so many of these issues, and it's a valid point that we ought to just make it explicit. And it's a great example of the kind of thing. So one vote for sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I don't think there's any benefit in putting out, I don't mean to sound critical, but like a milquetoast kind of document. I don't see any benefit in that. I see a lot of benefit in putting out a very strong statement as a group that says, when you as a commission put out a very strong statement naming the protagonist, the problem, that is in and of itself an action, because you are naming the people who need to be the protagonists who need to be regulated and controlled, and so in other words, before you even set the stage to name the policies, by putting out a very strong statement, we would as a commission be actually taking action. Again, it's late end of the day and I'm not being very articulate, but so I don't see any benefit in putting it out like this. I would see a lot of benefit in putting out before solutions a very strong statement.
Just wanted to add that one of the process things that we had talked about that is unfortunate because James and Mary Kay aren't here is the co-chairs have been actively trying to navigate these questions around what's the right nature of the language and the right process. And so because the two of them have been very actively engaged, one thing we could do very straightforwardly is take all of the feedback, get them back engaged in this process with us before the next meeting, and then see where we are at that point, because that's kind of what their role is as co-chairs, to see what the feedback was, where we are in the process, and bring something back. And by the way, these documents are, these are iterative drafts, so these things are still part of the conversation. It's a public process. So I think if it's okay, my suggestion to add on to what Julie said would be that we convene with and communicate with the co-chairs, have them take a cut at this, and then come back to the next meeting with, does this reflect the conversation in enough way that there's consensus to put it out at this point? Or if there's not, that's fine too.
How does that sound? Okay.
And I'm sorry, I just want to say, I don't actually think it's that complicated, respectfully, Carla. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but the language we always use in my work is definitely promote the high road, but create consequences for the low road. And it's the low road that is not named here. So I don't think it's that complicated. If we're going to talk about high road, there's clearly a low road. If we just name those two, I think we'd both be still creating the welcome wagon for the people who are doing it right, but being very clear about the fact that there is a low road, that who are the leaders of the low road, who are the drivers of the low road. That's what's missing.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm glad we got to the place that Carla thought we would get to eventually, and I would say it was relatively quick for a body this size and with under some scrutiny. So thank you all so much. Before we're going to move to public comment, but I wanted to actually throw out an idea, which was developed in conjunction in a conversation I had with Saru, which is part of both like engaging more folks around the conversation and part of maybe, seeing what some of the possibilities are that are already out there that we're hearing about, but seeing them live, is that we were going to throw out having an event the night before our San Diego convening. And it would be with high road restaurants who have signed on to ROC's challenge, to ROC's standards. And it would give us a chance, you all a chance, to hear from them, to see them in action. But what we wanted to do was make sure that there would be enough commissioners who would be there to make it worth doing. Of course, it would also be noticed and open to the public, and we'd have to work out some of the complexities of what that looks like. Like if we are going to an actual restaurant, a high road restaurant, one thing we've heard today is that high road restaurants, they're wonderful for society, for communities, for workers, but there are, there are costs that they absorb, and we're not going to ask them to absorb food for everybody who shows up. So we have to figure out some of the logistics. But if that is of interest, and I see that there's already some reaction to it, what we'd like to just hear back from you is whether you would come to such an event the night before. And again, it's a new added thing on the schedule. So if people can't make it, then that's, then we'll have to work around that. Okay.
So hearing no objection, it will be an optional dinner for anyone who would like to participate.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to say we have a really great group in San Diego of restaurant owners, which is why we thought if we're going there, it might be good to meet with them. We've been talking with them about statewide policy to create incentives for high road employers. So I think they have ideas around that. So, and it would be at one of these high road restaurants in San Diego.
Yeah. I mean, we had also internally, I had hoped to do something like that in LA, right? Again, given the vibrancy of the worker center, worker movements, and workers in LA, but it does take quite a bit of work to organize something like that. So what would be helpful is to hear from all of you. We'll ask the commissioners to let us know if you will actually attend. Okay. Okay, we'll let you know. Roy, we'll get back to you on that. We'll get back to you on that.
We are exactly at 4:30, so well done, Julie and Lenny. We have three kind of main categories for public comment this afternoon, so I'm actually going to do this a little bit differently and take them by category. And we're going to start with a number of folks from Rideshare Drivers United who wanted to speak about AB5. So we're going to start, and I will call the names. Everyone can come and speak for 1 minute. and join me at the mic. So our first speaker is Tammy Jean Lane.
Oh, yes, please.
Oh, you want me to
You have to
actually?
be mic'd because it's on,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Got a big enough mouth. Hi, my name is Tammy Jean Lane. I'm a driver for rideshare. I'm a rideshare driver. I'm also one of the organizers for Rideshare Drivers United. And we kind of want you to have a little bit of a personal view of what it is to be a rideshare driver right now. Myself, I was a massage therapist. And about 5 years ago, I went in to have shoulder surgery and they took an x-ray and found that I had lung cancer. So they took out the lung, great, still had the shoulder surgery, other surgeries. And I had to find a way to work because I could not do massage therapy. So I found Uber to start. And it was great because it gave me the ability to go to my doctor appointments, my therapy appointments. And it's taking a long time to get back because this is like 5 years ago, but 2.5 years ago, I was also diagnosed with breast cancer. Kept me out of my work, the thing that I have done for 30 years. So yes, to me, they were a rescue. However, a long time ago, I was making way more than I am now. I mean, prices have gone up. Gas is going up. As gas goes up, that comes out of my pocket. That's not, it's not compensated by the way, it's not added into our fees and stuff like that. And it's really, really hard when you are dependent on a certain kind of work. And so people will say, oh, just go get something else. Well, I need the flexibility, And now we're hearing, from Uber and all the rideshare apps, you might lose out on your flexibility if you don't just go along with us. Well, that's pretty darn threatening. Thank you very much. I'm trying to provide for myself, trying to be a working person in society. And I think that I'm doing a service, especially to people that are drunk out there that really need a ride home. Some people say, how can you take them? I said, I'm providing a service. And I'm going to take the time of some of my friends.
Okay.
Okay?
So that's 2
Is that
minutes.
okay? Because the more drunk people inside my car, the less on the outside of my car. But I don't know if you've seen the NBC4 News last week, or Fortune Magazine has also done an article that I spoke to about the safety in our cars, and it's not really being looked at by the rideshare organizations and stuff. So, with Rideshare Drivers United, I found a way to actually help us get back on track. And part of what we've done was we've helped to push through AB5. And now I'm going to try and wrap this up. I have a lot more to say, but you can read some articles about me. We really need, from this commission and from the state of California, is to enforce AB5. We all know that they're not going to make us employees. Well, shame on them. We are employees. We are categorized as employees. I know this is not news to you, but I need to put a face on what it really is like. That at 1 minute, a couple of years ago, you're making $1 a mile, and last March, we were making 80 cents a mile, and then we were making 60 cents a mile. And did you know that when they reduced that 20 cents a mile, they did not change what the fare is for the rider? Where did that go? Where did that go? That's not helping me pay my rent on time, I would like to go back into massage therapy, but I have to be healthy to do that. And even if I do go back, I'm still going to be here promoting this because it's fair. It's what's fair. And it's what's fair for all workers in the gig economy. And I want to commend you about talking about how, we're going backwards. Wait a minute. Work unions created a long time ago to help the worker. And now all of a sudden, poof, we've got an app company that says we don't have to employ you. Wait a minute. I am making you money. That makes me an employee. I can't negotiate my contract because I'm not an independent contractor. You want to negotiate a contract? Make me an employee. And we're going to stand up for everybody, not just rideshare drivers, but the whole gig economy. And I really would like to ask for your help. Thank you very much.
It was 4.5. So there are several of you. Does someone want to volunteer themselves for the next one? We'll do maybe 3 of you. Great, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Brian Dolber. I am Assistant Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Cal State San Marcos, and I've also been working with Rideshare Drivers United for about 1.5 years now. I've been sitting here grading papers about discourses of technology, and so it's been kind of interesting to observe the conversation as I've been doing that, and I want to thank the commissioners for pointing out the problems with the passive voice, because the passive voice does obfuscate power. And it says that we don't know where these problems come from, and they just seem to happen out of nowhere. And this is really common for how we talk about and think about new technologies in relationship to the economy. Rideshare Drivers United, with over 5,000 members, knows very well what's driving the problems in our economy right now. It's companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash that have decided that because they have the magic of Silicon Valley, they are somehow exempt from the laws that have governed the US labor force for over 80 years. California, thankfully, is at the forefront of the future of work in having passed AB 5. I think the best thing that we can do moving forward is to ensure that AB 5 is enforced in the way that Governor Newsom signed it, and that the commission ensure that it be enforced, and that the future of work in California is a future of justice. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's see, is Vanessa Bain here?
Hi, I, for the second time, find myself unprepared to speak today, but also feel compelled to. I just wanted to speak to the importance of defending and enforcing AB 5 beyond the scope of platform-based work and app-bossed workers like myself, and Instacart worker, and courier. The future of work is at stake here, and what gig companies get away with today, Walmart's gonna implement tomorrow. When I say that the future of labor is at stake, I don't mean that hyperbolically. I mean it quite literally. I think that we have an onus of responsibility to defend labor and the meaningful concessions that we've won over the last century that gig companies have worked to carve themselves out of. And I think that, you know, again, a law is only as meaningful as the enforcement and muscle used to back it up. And so I just call upon everybody to ensure that, you know, one, workers stay front and center in these conversations on enforcement, and that two, we don't allow companies to carve themselves out of the democratic process, and that we don't allow companies to self-exempt from labor law, because then what good is labor law, right? And I think that it's imperative that as the leader in the world right now on this issue, that we do right by workers, and that we set the example for how the future of work looks. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Megan Ortiz is here. Switching topics now to talk about worker voice.
Hi, thank you. My name is Megan Ortiz. I'm the Executive Director of el Instituto de Educación Popular del Sur de California, IDEBSCA. That probably took my whole minute. We organize with day laborers and domestic workers here in Los Angeles, operating 5 day labor centers in the city of Los Angeles. So I just think it's really important to name and recognize that day laborers and domestic workers are the original gig economy workers, is excluded, from worker protections that are rooted, and that exclusion is rooted in white supremacy. The future of work, right, seeks to further marginalize this sector of workers. If we don't have those workers represented here, in a space and in a way that's accessible, including by language. We know already that as a worker center organization, we fill an enormous and important gap in terms of skills training, in terms of job matching and other related services, including wage recovery and health and safety training and recourse for predominantly migrant workers. The future of work would continue to include exploitation, if we are ensuring that we are looking at the future of work from an intersectional perspective. And I'm glad to hear that, especially in the later part of today's hearing, that we're talking about issues of housing, health, childcare, and food, because we already know that this sector of workers, because of race, language, gender, identity, age, disability, and immigration status, can't access many of the existing state-sanctioned worker systems. For example, we don't see a labor shortage at our day labor centers and our domestic worker programs. Rather, we see an excess of institutional and structural racism. We don't think that we should train workers to be resilient in the context of displacement, but rather invest in place-based strategies that push back against displacement. For example, 6 years ago when I joined IDEBSCA, 30% of our members, which average about 1,000 a year, identified as houseless. That number is up to 50% right now. So the future of work is intersectional, is going to require policy and practice changes that are intersectional and that challenge what has been the status quo. All we need to do is listen to the stories of day laborers and domestic workers hired to hold hoses and stay with horses during wildfires here in Southern California, who currently have no recourse with Cal OSHA because many homeowners who hire are not seen as employers. So we're definitely pleased to see worker organizations here, and we really hope that we'll be able to bring workers here in a space that is open and accessible so that their stories can be heard in their own voices. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Daniela Alvareña.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniela Alvarenga, and I'm the workers organizer with the Pomona Economic Opportunity Center. We are also a day labor center supporting domestic workers, food vendors, and day laborers in Pomona, but also across the Inland Empire. And I want to echo Megan's thoughts that I appreciate the question that was posed today. What group of people are not usually included in this conversation that should be? And it's striking that in a convening about low-wage workers are not here and are not present in this discussion. Workers don't need to know the term workforce development to know and live, to know about the experiences and the inequality that exists in the workforce development system, because we know as work organizations that, like Megan said, we fill in a lot of the gaps because the workforce development system is not broken. It was designed to exclude low-wage workers. It was designed to exclude people of color. It's designed to exclude immigrant, undocumented workers. So I think that as these conversations and as these convenings continue to happen, we need to make the space to have the workers' voices heard. Because we did a quick survey with over 75 of our workers about what is workforce development. And the majority of them, over 70% of them, didn't know what it was. I work with day laborers in different cities, and the nearest AJCC is a mile away, and they didn't know that it existed. So I think when we think about the future of work, we need to move towards a place where every worker, undocumented workers, workers of color, disabled workers, right? Workers that identify with different gender-based identities are included in these conversations so that in 5, 10, 15 years, we have the future of work is for them and it's been created by them, right? As much as I respect the expertise and the knowledge of everyone at this table, I think the workers that are directly impacted are the experts of their own stories and should be a part and should be the ones crafting these policy solutions in tangent with everyone here. So thank you.
Thank you. Sasha Feldstein.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sasha Feldstein. I'm with the California Immigrant Policy Center. It's been a pleasure to be with you all since early this morning. So the California Immigrant Policy Center works with immigrant and refugee communities throughout the state, and I just want to express support for really what's already been said, but do want to call attention to the fact that of the problems that were listed, that were discussed among the commission, I do think one crucial thing that's missing is a conversation about immigration, which is so inextricably linked to the future of work, especially in California. If you want to have a report that is unique to California, that's immigration. Immigrant undocumented workers represent undocumented people represent 1 in 10 workers in the state. So if we're talking about the future of our workforce, we have to be talking about our immigrant communities who have a lot of different work authorization statuses that affords them different rights and protections that create enormous disparities in our communities. So I just want to extend a hand and an offer of support in thinking about ways that we can work to include some of those voices in conversations, because the future of our economy, the future of work, and the future of our workers really depends on it. So thank you.
Thank you. Becca Klauber. Is Becca still here? Okay, what about Olivia Rayner? Is Olivia still here? Okay, I think that is the total for public comment in terms of topics. Thank you.
Yeah. So obviously, we're all looking over there and applauding because we really are grateful to you both for taking the time to get out here and for speaking with such authenticity and honesty about the issues that you face. Really, really critical for us. And I know I speak for everybody else, especially the commissioners, but the state of California folks who are here too. Thank you for that. And thank you to the commissioners. I think, we're getting to, increasingly exciting in our work and challenging. And I think it's just so great that we have built the amount of trust that has taken place here around this commission to be able to move on to our next phase. So we will see you in January and we will follow up. And please do look at what we send when we follow up, because there will be some specific things about what's supposed to happen in January. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.